Shaine March, it falls to me to sentence you today for the murder of Alana Odysseos. Today we have heard the powerfully moving and indeed heartbreaking personal statements of Alana's father Alan, her mother Karen, and her three sisters Lorraine, Tara, and Jasmine. Tara described Alana as a kind, caring, funny, and deeply protective person. Jasmine, who also gave evidence during your trial, told us today that Alana was a, quote, bright, loud, loving woman who filled a room with music and laughter, close quote. She told us that Alana loved to dance, she loved music, she loved her little daughter Victoria, and at one time, tragically for her, she loved you too. Each of Alana's father, mother, and three sisters spoke of Alana's deep love for her daughter Victoria. The depth of the pain and grief that they have suffered as a result of your crime cannot be fathomed by those who've not experienced the horror of such a tragedy. No sentence that I pass today can possibly reflect the value of Alana's life or in any way properly offset the depth of grief and sense of loss of Alana's family and everyone else who loved her. Before turning to the sentence that I must impose, it is necessary to say something about the facts of this case in order to make clear the factual basis on which you are sentenced. Except where I have indicated otherwise, I am sure to the criminal standard about the following matters of fact. In relation to certain matters where I may express a view on the facts, but I'm not sure to the criminal standard, I make clear now that I sentence you, as I must, on the factual basis most favorable to you. At about 3 a.m. on Monday morning, the 22nd of July, 2024, neighbours found Alana outside her home on Lynmouth Road in Walthamstow, London E17. She was bleeding from multiple stab wounds. Two of the neighbours rang 999. When first discovered, Alana was still able to shout, quote, "Shaine stabbed me. He stabbed me," close quote. She pointed at you as you walked away, while her neighbours began to try to help her. Alana lived at 58 The Grange, Lynmouth Road, with Victoria, who was then a little over 2 years old. Alana had been in a relationship with you for about 4 months. She had recently discovered she was pregnant. She was a vulnerable young woman who had suffered serious personal losses, including the loss of her former partner, Ruslan, Victoria's father, who had committed suicide. During your trial, we heard evidence that Alana had confided in family and friends about your controlling and abusive behavior towards her, including physical assaults and emotional manipulation. In her evidence at trial, Jasmine told us about an exchange of WhatsApp messages with Alana on the evening of the 21st of July, just hours before she died. Alana told Jasmine about feeling unwell, about your, quote, acting up, close quote, about your own pain, about her own pain and your indifference to it, and about her need to protect Victoria. Alana said to her sister, quote, "Can't help who you love, but he don't love any of us," close quote. She was afraid of you, but she loved you still, and she hoped that you would change. Later that evening, neighbours heard a prolonged row between a man and a woman at Alana's address. During the trial, the jury saw and heard video evidence of at least part of that row because you were video recording it on your phone. What the neighbours heard appeared to be a dispute about a pair of trainers. You were heard shouting abuse, and Elena was heard apologising to you. Neighbours heard references to her pregnancy during your row. At some point, the row moved outside. Elena had forgotten her keys, but you refused to let her back into the flat where her daughter was sleeping. During the trial, we saw a CCTV clip of Elena outside in her dressing gown, walking along Station Road towards Lynmouth Road on her own shortly before midnight. At some point, a couple of hours later, Elena was in her flat. Again. You picked up a knife, you stabbed her at least 19 times, and you slashed her with the knife at least 5 times. A number of the wounds she suffered were defensive injuries as she tried to protect herself. The stab wounds that you inflicted to her legs were consistent with her being on the ground and kicking out. Elena's blood was found both inside and outside her flat. Just before 3 a.m., neighbours found Elena outside, bleeding and repeatedly naming you as her attacker. 2 of the neighbours rang 999 seconds apart at 2:58 a.m. Despite the efforts of her neighbours and then the emergency services, who arrived within minutes of the 999 calls, Elena's condition rapidly deteriorated. She was pronounced dead at 3:52 a.m. Victoria was found unarmed inside the flat. She was now an orphan. After the attack, you were seen by neighbours and on CCTV walking away, disposing as you went of the knife, of clothing, of a small rucksack, and of items from Elena's flat. The knife, which was a kitchen knife measuring 24 centimetres in length and 2.8 centimetres at its widest point, was found abandoned nearby in front of a neighbour's door. It was heavily stained with Elena's blood. The police later discovered that you had put 3 mobile phones down a drain in a road near Lynmouth Road. Only one of those phones was eventually recovered. On the recovered phone, the police found 2 voice notes that you had recorded in which you admitted the killing. One voice note was apparently intended for your probation officer. The other was intended for your mother. Neither voice note was sent. After wandering around Walthamstow for a while, you entered Cream's Cafe on Church Hill at about 4:20 a.m. The man working there at the time, on his own, remembers you saying to him something about stabbing or killing your wife, quote, who has baby, close quote. The man rang the police. The police arrived shortly before 5 a.m. and arrested you at Cream's Cafe. You made several admissions at the time, including, quote, I did it, I killed her, close quote, and, quote, I stabbed her to death, close quote. On the way to the police station, you made further comments to the police officers caught on body-worn video, which was viewed by the jury during the trial, comments about the incident and about your relationship with Elena. Later that day, you were interviewed by the police in the presence of a solicitor and an appropriate adult. You answered no comment to all questions put to you. On the following morning, 23rd of July, you were charged with the murder of Alana Odysseos. You were cautioned and made no reply. You appeared at Barkingside Magistrates Court, where you were remanded in custody and taken to His Majesty's Prison, Belmarsh. Within 48 hours, you were required to appear for a bail hearing before a judge of this court, the Central Criminal Court, which you did via a video link from HMP Belmarsh. There was a lengthy delay before your hearing, during all of which time you were with a prison officer. That prison officer gave evidence at the trial. He told the jury that at some point, while you were waiting for your bail hearing to begin, you began to talk to him about the murder, telling him that you'd killed your partner and giving him a reasonably detailed account of what had happened that evening. You told him about putting 3 phones down a drain, one of which, as I've already said, was later recovered by police as a result of this admission. You also told him that you had been arguing with Elena about your trainers. You found yourself in the kitchen with Elena, you, quote, saw red, close quote, you grabbed the knife and you stabbed her. You told the prison officer that she said, quote, please stop, please stop. You have murdered me, close quote. Dr. Matthew Sika, the consultant forensic pathologist who conducted the post-mortem examination of Elena's body on the 23rd of July, the day after she died, found 23 sharp force injuries to her body, including 19 stab wounds and 5 slashed or incised wounds. A number of the stab wounds had been inflicted with a high degree of force, approaching severe force, as evidenced by the fact that 3 of the stab wounds involved the knife penetrating through bone, including one that passed through Elena's shoulder blade. Dr. Sika found that there were 5 separate stab wounds, each of which, on its own, would have been fatal. There was a 6th stab wound that, on its own, might have been fatal. Some of the wounds appeared to be defensive injuries to her arms and legs, resulting from her efforts to protect herself. Dr. Sika also confirmed that Elena was in the early stages of pregnancy at the time of her death. He estimated that she was about 7 to 8 weeks pregnant. He gave the formal cause of her death as stab wounds to her chest. You were 46 years old at the time you killed Elena. You are 47 years old now. When you were 17 years old, you suffered a traumatic brain injury, as a result of which you suffered some permanent deterioration in your cognitive function. On the 22nd February 1995, when you were 17 years old, you were convicted of assault on police and criminal damage. Later that year, on the 16th of August, you were convicted of assault occasioning actual bodily harm and criminal damage. I note that the first of these offences occurred before your traumatic brain injury and the second afterwards. On the 19th of January 2000, when you were 21 years old, you stabbed a 17-year-old boy named Andre Drummond in the neck outside a McDonald's on Denmark Hill. The injury was fatal. You had travelled there to confront some boys, including the victim, whom you considered had been involved in robbing a friend of yours. On the 17th of July 2000, the jury at your trial at this court rejected your defense of self-defense and convicted you of murder. You were sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 13 years. On the 29th of January 2013, you were released from custody on life license. But you were recalled to prison later that year, on the 17th of July, after committing an offence of common assault on your then partner, who was pregnant, and a related offence of criminal damage. The assault involved you stamping on your then partner's belly. Just under 5 years later, on the 5th of February 2018, you were again released from custody on life license. For the next nearly 6 years and 5 months, you were living in the community on your life license without committing any further offences until you attacked and killed Elena on the 22nd of July 2024. On the 8th of October 2025, the first day of your trial for the murder of Alana Odysseos, you pleaded guilty to manslaughter on the basis of diminished responsibility. This meant that you formally admitted that you had killed Elena unlawfully, and you had done so intending to kill her or intending to cause her really serious bodily harm. On the 17th of October 2025, after the prosecution had completed the presentation of its evidence against you and had closed its case, you asked to be rearraigned in the presence of the jury, and you then pleaded guilty to murder. Upon hearing that plea, the jury duly returned a verdict against you of guilty of murder. The sentence for murder fixed by law is imprisonment for life. The first question I must decide is whether it is necessary in this case to impose a whole life order, meaning that the early release provisions would not apply, and you could never be released from prison other than by order of the Home Secretary on compassionate grounds. I can only impose a whole life order if I conclude that I must. It is an exceptional sentence, rarely imposed, reserved for cases of the of the most extreme gravity. The Court of Appeal has given guidance on the imposition of whole life orders in the case of the Crown and Stewart, 2022 EWCA Crim 1063, in particular at paragraph 19. Under paragraph 2.1 of Schedule 21 to the Sentencing Act 2020, the appropriate starting point for sentence for the offence of murder is a whole life order if the offender is aged 21 or over when the offence was committed and the court considers that the seriousness of the offence is exceptionally high. Paragraph 2.2e indicates that cases that would normally be considered cases of exceptionally high seriousness include a case such as this one, where the offender was previously convicted of murder. Applying the principles in Stewart, however, I do not consider this to be one of those, quote, rarest and clearest of cases where the need for lifelong imprisonment is, quote, clear beyond doubt, close quote. In reaching this conclusion, which I have carefully considered, I have taken into account a number of factors, including the following. You suffered a traumatic brain injury when you were 17 years old, which has affected your cognitive ability and your ability to regulate your emotions and your behavior. Secondly, both the murder you committed in 2000 and the murder of Elena were apparently spontaneous attacks, not premeditated, although I do note the following. In relation to the murder of Andre Drummond, you may not have planned to kill him or any of his companions, but you travelled to the place where you expected to find them, armed with a knife, prepared for violence in circumstances that you knew would be confrontational. The murder of Elena involved prolonged and excessive violence. This is a significant aggravating factor that I must take into account in determining your sentence, and to which, therefore, I will return. The third factor that I take into account in reaching the conclusion that this is not a case where I must impose a whole life order is that there is a gap of over 24 years between the two murders, and prior to the murder of Elena, you had lived for almost 6.5 years in the community on life license without committing any offences. And the final factor that I've taken into account in reaching this conclusion is that you ultimately pleaded guilty to Elena's murder after the close of the prosecution case, when Dr. Marzio Ascioni, the expert neuropsychologist on whose evidence you intended to rely to establish a partial defence of diminished responsibility, revised his opinion after a further review of the evidence and concluded that at the time of Elena's murder you were not suffering an abnormality of mental functioning sufficient to meet the legal threshold for the partial defence. I must therefore impose a minimum term order. This is clearly a case where the seriousness of the offence is particularly high within the meaning of paragraph 3 of Schedule 21. In reaching that view, I take into account the following factors, which I am permitted to do, even though they are not expressly set out in paragraph 3 of Schedule 21. First, you have a prior conviction for murder, namely the murder of Andre Drummond in 2000, for which you were subject to a life sentence at the time you killed Elena while you were out on life license. Secondly, you killed Elena knowing that she was pregnant. It appears that at least one of the stab wounds was aimed towards her reproductive organs. In any event, it was clear that you intended to kill her and that her baby would therefore, at that early stage of pregnancy, have no chance of surviving the attack. The statutory starting point is therefore a minimum term of 30 years. There are a number of serious aggravating features. As to statutory aggravating features, I take into account the following. First, the fact that you repeatedly or continuously engaged in behavior towards Elena that was controlling or coercive while you were in an intimate relationship with her. And secondly, in committing the offence, you used sustained and excessive violence towards Elena. In relation to the first of these two statutory aggravating factors, I base this conclusion on unchallenged evidence at the trial, which included not only what friends and family of Elena were told by Elena, which is hearsay evidence, but also on the observations of those witnesses of Elena's presentation and conduct, particularly when you were present, either directly or at the end of a phone. I've also had regard to the Sentencing Council overarching guideline on domestic abuse, and so I take into account, in relation to this factor, the fact that this murder was committed during the course of a domestic relationship where trust should have existed between you, and it occurred in Elena's own home where she was entitled to feel safe. The second of these two statutory aggravating factors is one of particularly high seriousness. You did not just grab a knife in a moment of anger, stab Elena, and then drop it, horrified by what you had done. You stabbed again and again and again in various parts of her body. There were 19 stab wounds and at least 5 more incised knife wounds. As I've already said, at least 5 of the wounds would individually have been fatal, and a 6th wound might well also have been fatal on its own. Several of these stab wounds, at least 3, were delivered with severe force. Additional serious aggravating features include the following, although I must be careful to avoid double counting. First, the prolonged nature of your assault on Elena would have caused her considerable mental as well as physical suffering before her death, with the violence starting inside her flat and continuing outside. It is clear from a number of things that she said that were heard by witnesses that she was fully conscious that you had subjected her to a lethal attack. Secondly, you used a knife to kill her. Thirdly, your murderous attack on Elena occurred in the flat where Victoria was present nearby, sleeping. There is additional aggravation given your other offending history, including your assault on your then pregnant girlfriend in 2013, and the efforts you made after your attack on Elena to dispose of evidence. In terms of mitigation, the only statutory mitigating factor is your lack of premeditation. I have, however, already taken this into account in deciding that a whole life order is not required in your case. Similarly, I've already taken into account the following factors in deciding that a whole life order is not required: your plea of guilty made after the close of the prosecution case, your traumatic brain injury at the age of 17, and your lack of offending between the time of your second release from custody on your life sentence in February 2018 and the murder of Elena in July 2024. Given the number, severity, and location of the stab wounds that you inflicted on Elena, as well as the intensity of your attack on her, I am sure that you intended to kill her. Your intention to kill is not an aggravating factor, but it means that there is no mitigation for your having a lesser intent. I have read the references that have been provided and uploaded to the digital case system about you, but they cannot and do not carry any real weight in mitigation in a case such as this. The only other mitigation available to you is some evidence of mental ill health, namely an antisocial personality disorder and diagnosed depression. Ultimately, the expert witnesses, instructed by the prosecution and the defense, agreed that a categorical diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, could not be made out despite some symptoms you showed of hyperarousal and an exaggerated sense of threat. I have had regard to the Sentencing Council guideline on sentencing offenders with mental disorders, developmental disorders, or neurological impairments. In assessing the degree to which this factor mitigates your offence, I have had regard to all of the evidence adduced at trial. Accordingly, I must now set the minimum term that you will serve before the parole board can consider you for release, having regard to the statutory minimum term, the starting point for the statutory minimum term that I've identified, and taking into account the aggravating features and the mitigation that I've also identified. The aggravating features very heavily outweigh the available mitigation. You and everyone else in court should understand three things about the minimum term that I am about to impose. First, you must serve every day of it before the parole board can even consider releasing you. Secondly, even then, the parole board will only release you if it is satisfied that it is safe and appropriate to release you. Otherwise, you will remain in custody for the rest of your life. Thirdly, if you are ever released from custody, you will remain subject to the life sentence for the remainder of your life, which means that if necessary, you can be returned to custody at any time. The truth of the matter is that given your age and the length of the minimum term I must impose, it may be that you will never be released from prison, but the chance exists. Following your arrest for the murder of Elena, you were recalled to prison to continue serving your life sentence for the murder of Andre Drummond. There are therefore no days on remand in custody to be deducted from the minimum term that I must impose. The statutory surcharge applies to this sentence. Shaine March, please stand up. Shaine March, in the early hours of the 22nd of July 2024, you stabbed Alana Odysseos to death, killing her when she was pregnant with your child, leaving her then 2-year-old daughter an orphan, and devastating the lives of her family forever. In determining the appropriate minimum term you must serve for your life sentence, I've had regard to all of the evidence presented at your trial, a careful assessment of the culpability of factors leading to my conclusion that the seriousness of your offence was particularly high, and balancing the applicable aggravating factors and the available mitigation. For the murder of Alana Odysseos, I sentence you to life imprisonment with a minimum term to serve of 42 years.